Okay, I think it's time. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's 2 o'clock, so I'm about to go. So thank you for joining this session. I'm Tom Sherrington, and it's my second time here. I was delighted to come here last year, and I've just seen a fantastic session with Oliver Caviglioli. So I feel like I've got to up my game here because that was just it was fantastic. So what I'm going to talk about is this: why is Barak Rosenshines' Principles of Instruction paper so popular and so powerful? And the image you see there is actually the cover of a book, which is going to come out in the UK in May and in the US in July. And I was asked to write it because I gave a talk on this at a researchED event in the US in October, and the people there said, look, we really think this is something which a lot of teachers would really like to read about. So why don't you write it into a short book? So I'm pretty excited about that. But I'm just piggybacking on this amazing guy, Barak Rosenshine, and sharing his ideas. And I found that it has been very useful. I am a teacher trainer. Most of my working life I spend in a college or a school helping teachers and the leaders of teachers to move teachers on and make teachers more effective. And I find talking about Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction incredibly useful. And a part of the talk is what the paper includes, but part of the talk is why is it therefore such a useful paper for teacher development generally. It adds to this in the book I wrote a couple of years ago, Learning Rainforest, this idea that what we're trying to do as teachers is we're trying to gather evidence, we're trying to assimilate a lot of information about what makes effective practice and combine it with our values system, which we all operate within, and develop a kind of wisdom so that when we're in the classroom, we make good decisions. We answer the right questions. We structure our activities in the right way to make sure that students develop the knowledge. And that's what we're after. And the more wisdom we have, the better decisions we're going to make and the more students will learn. And that's logical. So Rosenshine is all about trying to get the maximum amount of wisdom, if you like, from the knowledge base that research has provided with us. And I use this metaphor of the trees. The trees in the learning rainforest represent the students, but for me they also represent teachers. And actually over the years I've come to the conclusion that specifying the model teacher is a really bad idea. What you need to do is work with the teachers that you have and to work with them so they become better teachers, a better version of themselves. So we can explore the possibilities for what they can achieve. And one of the best ways to do that is to build their knowledge, to educate teachers about how learning works, and so that people have got a stronger model for the learning process. And that's one of the reasons I think Rosenshine's paper is so useful. It's a really great way to engage with the knowledge base that's out there around about the teaching. And it helps us then move teachers on to be a better kind of teacher than we were before. It's actually a massive challenge. If you think about how much information there is to assimilate. I've been reading educational research and books for a while now, and I still find every week, like just now in the session with Oliver, a new ideas popped into my head where I think, gosh, that's such an interesting way to frame that, and how am I going to turn that into something useful? And it's a constant flow of this. So it's a massive challenge, even for someone who's actively engaged with research, to try to form a coherent model for how to teach differently. For a teacher who's teaching 20 hours a week, flat out, for them to absorb that information and then make a conscious decision to change, that's a massive undertaking. And we need to make that easy, people who are supporting teachers, or else it's just not going to happen. So, Barak Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction. I carry a copy with me pretty much everywhere. This is it. It's short, which is good. It's about this long. That's it. So, one of the great things is it's a PDF, it's free, you just download it, and you can share it. You can email it to everyone in your school and say, read this. It's actually often the form of it. This one here comes from the American Educator magazine in 2012. But it's actually originally started off as a pamphlet, this long and thin pamphlet, which was produced from the International Academy of Education in the US. And it's free. They just say, take it, have it, publish it wherever you like. It's there to be found. And it's pretty much word for word in this version as in this version. They're identical. So it kind of originates. Now, one of the things I've found is that trying to explain 10 things in a short presentation is actually quite difficult. So what I've found when you read the paper is that some of the ideas link, and there's actually 4 themes. And with the help of Oliver, who's sitting there, we've made this poster for people to kind of say, well, there are essentially 4 main themes. There's things to do with reviewing material, questioning, sequencing concepts, and stages of practice. And that, again, sort of taking 10 ideas and down into 4 is as a way of breaking this idea down, making it accessible. And all of these things are evidenced in the way that Rosenshine presents. So he has a couple of very simple structures. First of all, he talks about in the classroom, what the research says is this, and in the classroom, it looks like this. So it's a neat flow all the way through the document. In the classroom, you're applying the research, and it's neatly summarized. And in the original paper, it's also all the citations are there. But he also then uses a neat language of saying, more effective teachers typically do these things, and less effective teachers typically do these things. So it's pretty crude, but who doesn't want to be in the camp of more effective teachers? I know I do. So I'm thinking, if someone says more effective teachers do this, I'm going to think, yeah, well, I want to be like them. So what is that? And I'm interested. And it's not sort of criticizing anybody, but it does give you this thing. He also talks about the origins of the research. So he says it comes from 3 places. It comes from observing teachers, it comes from cognitive science, and it comes from studies of specific instructional interventions. And then what he concludes is that the suggestions from those 3 sources for how teachers should behave are pretty similar, overlaps to a significant degree, which gives us confidence that they are good bets. And it would be different if, for example, when you observed teachers who seemed to get good results, if you observed them and they were doing things which were different to what, say, the cognitive science suggested, we'd be confused about that. But that is not the case. So I feel that this gives us confidence. When you read the Rosenshine paper, you think, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. That makes sense as a teacher. It makes sense as someone who's observed lots of lessons. And you think, I believe this. It feels sensible. It feels familiar. And I think that's really important. If teachers don't believe something, they're just going to say, forget it. If teachers trust the source, if they recognize themselves in the source, they're going to think, I'm going to buy into this. And so it cuts through. It cuts through. And this is what we need in research communication. We need this. We need to break away from what I call speed camera behaviors, where a lot of schools have this, horrific kind of regimes for this is how you should teach. And when the formal lesson observation process is underway, the teachers sort of get out the thing I need to do to impress my manager to get my pay rise kind of a thing. And then the rest of the time, they teach the way they like. Now, that's not very healthy, is it? If we're only sort of turning on the style when people are watching us. What we need is for people to teach really well when no one's looking. Because those are the lessons which really raise outcomes. Day in, day out, the way I teach is slightly more effective than yesterday. That's got to be moving on. We need to change our habits. And I'm working with teachers for a long time doing this. I feel that the language and the areas of attack that Rosenshine is following in his paper are a good bet for changing teacher habits. Partly because they're not about doing things or not doing them. They're about how well do you do certain things you already do. So they feel familiar. So we all ask questions. It's just a question of how well do we ask them and could we do it more? Underpinning it is a bit of cognitive science. So this idea that teachers have all these different kind of characteristics, and they have I found a big variation in what teachers think is the one at the bottom highlighted, theory of action. I've worked with some teachers where the way that they think learning works is really problematic. They talk about learning sinking in and things like that, and it doesn't really work that way. So Rosenshine does use the cognitive science to underpin what he says. He talks about schema and he talks about working memory, and it builds a good coherent language which the teachers can share about how learning works. So we don't download learning like in this old meme. This is a 1920s image imagining that we just sort of fed the books into the hopper. In fact, I was at a school before Christmas where the head teacher looked exactly like that man there. It's quite embarrassing. I had to say, look, sorry, this isn't personal. But, the idea that I guess he's choosing the books, the curriculum. But we don't just sort of download information. We have to consciously, generate. Learning as a generative activity is important. And this idea of knowledge in long-term memory underpins what Rosenshines is saying. So the idea about schema comes throughout it. Schema, knowledge builds on knowledge. We're consciously helping our students to layer up knowledge, to organize their knowledge, to build a framework for what they understand. And crucially, to practice making those connections. The more fluent we are with something depends on how often we've followed a certain path. So the ideas of practice come through very, very strongly. So building a schema, the ideas about practice, the problem with forgetting things and needing to remember, all of these things come through the Rosenshine principles. And I think it's important to explore this with teachers before you just say, read Rosenshine. We need to have a language for schema and a shared understanding that knowledge builds on knowledge, and this is what we're up to. So let's get into it. Now, what does he say? There's a whistle-stop tour. The first area is sequencing concepts and modelling. So there are three principles. There's presenting material in small steps, which attends to working memory being finite, and the idea that we can't just overload students. We need to build knowledge up. That we provide models for how learning works. And there's lots of aspects of modelling. There's modelling your thinking. There's models of what excellence will look like. There's conceptual models. So modelling has lots of parts to it. And there's also scaffolding, the idea that you allow students, effective teachers will set high expectations for students, but they'll show them how to achieve those things and then pull the scaffolding away. So in practice, that means you have to understand your curriculum. This isn't a generic thing, really. This sequence is about understanding your curriculum. And I put it here at the first thing because it's the sort of thing you need to plan before you go into the classroom. So, for example, if you look at something like this, adding fractions. Adding fractions isn't one thing. Adding fractions is a whole series of steps, and a good math teacher will be able to deconstruct the process of adding fractions into a number of stages, recognizing what fractions are, recognizing that we need to find this idea of a lowest common multiple and what that means in a some kind of conceptual model. And I work with teenagers who find maths incredibly difficult, and often their schema for basic fractions and numbers is very, very weak. You can't just wipe that away. You've got to build around who you have got and structure a curriculum which allows them to build a schema more securely. So, for example, sometimes you need to go back to a basic model of say, algebra. What do we mean by a plus 4? What are we talking about? Do we have a model for that? Have we sequenced that properly? Sometimes students' schema is so sort of broken around the concept of algebra that they're being asked to do things that they've lost the framework for. You have to return to some kind of concrete example. So effective teachers will link abstract ideas to concrete examples, build on the knowledge the students have already got, and then go from there. Multiple worked examples is another feature of it. You don't just learn how to do something by copying one. This is well rehearsed through the work of a number of cognitive scientists, the power of worked examples. We study successful solutions, and as soon as you've got seen 3 of the same type of problem, your cognitive load diminishes, and you can start seeing the pattern, and the method becomes much more obvious. And all these things are part of building a good model of the curriculum. It's not just that, though. It's things like knowing how to sequence experience from tacit knowledge and the experience of, say, looking at bugs, looking at insects, say, in a jar that you've just captured, and looking at them and getting a sense of that insects are real things before you start labeling the diagram and worrying about the technical name for the abdomen or the antenna. That's a kind of abstract idea until you know that insects have these things and you've seen them for real. So knowing how you build from the concrete to the abstract is part of the sequencing of a curriculum. Things like, if you're going to understand electric motors, I actually literally did this last Monday in a physics class. It's my favorite thing. I'm a physics teacher by trade, and I got so excited we actually made motors. And there's so much tacit knowledge. There's so much experience you get from fiddling around and making a connection, making the circuit, feeling the force. And that's an important part of sequencing before we get to the abstraction and the rules and the physics equations. The equations are very hard to connect to if you don't have a kind of a concrete home for that knowledge to sit. So a knowledge sequencing has lots of dimensions to it. And Rosenshine implicitly references that in the principles about knowledge in small steps, models, and then building scaffolds. It's a bit like learning to ride a bike. You don't just get on a go. I mean, some students can, but with riding a bike, we have a well-established sort of sequence which we follow, which we have stabilizers on, we build confidence with that, and then when the children are ready, we take the stabilizers off, and they're off. And I often tell the story of my daughter when she learned to ride a bike. I literally did this with her. We took the stabilizers off. She needed it. She didn't know. She couldn't do it properly. And then I held onto the saddle as we went into the park. And then the moment came when she said, "You can let go now, Dad." And I said, "I already have." She was away. And it's like, and that's an example of learning, having this sequence. And Rosenshine is very clear that we need to know what the sequence is, build it very deliberately, and allow the learning to form in that way. I think the heart of the Rosenshine paper for me is this: asking questions. And this comes through a lot of studies. If you read Nuttall or Dylan William or anyone, instructional teaching is highly interactive. We need to check that learning has been is happening. And in fact, what I love about this, in the earliest draft of Rosenshine's work that I could find, 1982, he wrote this paper called Instructional Teaching, Instructional Functions. And this is it typed up, looks beautiful. This is before computers. And underlined in that paper, it says checks for understanding. It's the only part of the paper that's underlined. So checking for understanding for Rosenshine is a really, really key thing. You don't teach something and hope the students have learnt it. You check. And the analogy I often use is around something dangerous like abseiling, where if you were teaching abseiling, before you sent your students off the cliff, you would definitely check that they had understood what to do. You wouldn't just say, well, hope for you wouldn't just show them and then go to the bottom of the cliff and say, good luck, guys, hope. You would say, I need to check you can do this. So checking for understanding is something which I find, as an observer of many lessons, is probably the single biggest weakness relative to how important it is. The teachers so often will just ask a question, look for some kind of warm feeling from the room, and then move on. And Rosenshine actually, in his earlier papers, explicitly talks about how not to check for understanding. So in other words, don't just say, is everyone okay with that, guys? Yeah? Everyone okay? Yeah? Any questions? No? Awesome. Great. That means we're ready. Teachers do that every day. And they will definitely do this. They will definitely ask one student, do you know? Good. Thank you. You know. Everyone else okay? And everyone just goes, yeah. And I test this out all the time. Just because your neighbour knows something does not tell you anything about what you know. And checking for understanding is a really important part of it. So we have a repertoire of questioning techniques. A good teacher will cold call. They will select who to ask questions from, because that means that they really can make everybody think. They will do this knowing opt-out. They will make sure everyone is involved, that every learner needs to be on their toes. Probing questioning. What Rosenshine says is, effective teachers ask more questions than less effective teachers. They also involve more students. And when they get to a student, they will ask questions in a more probing style. So if you follow the Rosenshine principles, when you're questioning, you are, instead of going a bit from you, a bit from you, a bit from you, you will go, right, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You will be having a little dialogue, a little series of dialogues, checking for understanding. Well, did you understand what they said? So probing questioning. This is a kind of, what it looks like. This sort of things like, is there a difference? Can you give me an example? Why? How do you know? Are you sure? And why did you think of that? That's true, but isn't that the same? You probe, you challenge. And one of my favourite case studies for this is when I work with teachers on this, is I use the question, something which they all you think you might know the answer to. Why does the sun rise in the east? And boy, this is great. You get adults talking about this, and they're thinking, do I know it? And they're starting to sort of do all this more, and where's the sun? And then you start thinking, well, you didn't even know you understood it yourself, so you check for understanding. But if I was a teacher teaching this, I wouldn't say, right, let's get a bit from you, and you say something like, the earth rotates. Good. And you say something like, the sun is a long way away. Yes. And piece the answer together. And then after 3 or 4 of these things, we go, dunno, we've explained it. That's no good, because having a collective answer, it doesn't tell you about any one individual's understanding. So a Rosenshine influenced questioning sequence would say, okay, the earth spins, but which direction? And we actually work together while everyone else is listening, and we get an answer together. And then I say, what did you understand now? Let me check for understanding from you. And I probe with you. And this is deeper. It's richer. I'm getting more feedback as the teacher about what is being understood. I'm not kidding myself into thinking the explanation is deeper. So checking for understanding is so important. And I do think it's a big shift that teachers make. It's a big difference between asking, have you understood? And what have you understood? The power of the what there is massive. Have you understood? What's the answer to that? Yes, get on with it. Don't hassle me. Or the delusion, yes, I've understood. But what have you understood? It's like, yeah, tell me then. What did you understand? And then you have to actually articulate that properly, and then I'm getting feedback to me about, okay, not quite, sort of, and I'm able to then push on. So what have you understood is such an important question. Okay, but what about forgetting then? So Rosenshine then says a really good teacher will attend to the issue of forgetting, and daily review and weekly and monthly review are part of his strategies. Now, daily review is slightly different from weekly and monthly review. Daily review means, we're building on a series of knowledge, a knowledge sequence over some lessons in a row, and we need to activate the knowledge from yesterday, from today. And, it takes a bit of time for learning to land. We've teed up all the ideas yesterday. There's this whole reconsolidation process which goes on in memory, and then we need to see, where did it all land from yesterday. So let's just activate that learning and see where we got to. So I might, from yesterday's lesson about the sunrise, I might say, look, I want you to write down on your paper, why does the sun rise in the east? We went through it yesterday. Let's see what you can remember. And now check. How did you do? That's what we agreed yesterday. How did you do? And everyone is having to think. You have a chance to think about it first, and then everyone is involved. You do this so that everyone has to do it, or you quiz each other. You can say in your pairs, one of you look at this, and the other one explain, why does the sun rise in the east? And you could check each other off. So you do what Dylan William calls using students as resources for one another. To check, did you get it? Have you there? So everyone's now thinking about where we were yesterday. So that's one form of it. Or it could be that we've taught a load of words. These are the words we learnt yesterday, some really useful English words. This is what they mean. So we learnt these words yesterday or last week. And of course, they're quite complicated. I'm now going to sort of do a quiz. I'm going to say, okay, a quick retrieval practice. My favorite type of this is silent. You don't even need to know what the students think. You need them to know. The most important person to know whether they know something is the student, not you. So doing something like this, do you know the answers? So the students have to think to themselves, so which ones do I know? I definitely know I don't know this. And are you checking for, and you don't even have to sort of get them to tell you. You just say, okay, well, here's the answers. Which ones did you get right? And they can say, which ones did you get wrong? Well, I didn't know this one. Okay, we can discuss wrong answers. It's a much more fruitful discussion very often. So getting students to evaluate their knowledge. Look, we learnt these words last month. You should all be using them now. Write them in a sentence or write them in a paragraph or just a simple quiz. But there's so many ways of checking over time. One thing that a school in London I know does this. They recognise that sometimes you provide students with information like this. They find it hard to penetrate. They don't quite know what they're meant to know. And so quizzing is a really important way of getting students to think about whether they know things. So do I know everything I'm supposed to know about selective breeding? Well, the way to tell is to answer these questions. So we've done the unit. Check your knowledge. Just before we even apply the knowledge to difficult questions, just do a quick knowledge check. And this is maybe a month later after we'd taught the unit. Can you still answer those questions? So you don't say to the students, is everyone okay? You're on selective breeding, yeah? In some hopeful way. You say, okay, guys, you should be able to do this quiz. We showed it to you before. Let's have a go. And then we talk about their answers. So quizzing is really, really powerful. This is basic factual recall as a building block for deeper questioning. And that's something which you build into your routine. It means that when you're preparing to teach, you prepare for future recall. So if I'm teaching a topic like the history, trial by ordeal, the medieval use of terrible punishments to see if people were guilty of crimes, like a hot iron bar in their hand, and if they were guilty, it would be all septic and pussy after a few days, and if they were innocent, it would heal miraculously, that kind of thing. But if you're teaching this in a lesson, we can sort of infuse people with the stories, but if we want them to really learn things and organize their information into a schema, we need to help them. So we would say, look, let's get some notes down, and we teach students to organize the information. So we say, let's trial by ordeal. There's trial by fire, trial by water, trial by combat. So we help them organize their schema, and we then link that to a retrieval. So we say maybe a few weeks later, or even the next lesson, okay, guys. Last lesson, we learnt about trial by ordeal. Let's see what can you remember. Fill in that grid. And we give them a blank version. And we say, okay, let's see what you can remember. And then we say, well, what did you get? Did you get everything we learnt? So if you teach trial by ordeal with future recall in mind, you structure the learning, you plan activities to check later. It's part of how you organize your thinking. So the students can organize their knowledge and remember it. And it's part of how you construct a whole curriculum. Plus also, when we're teaching, we're precise about what we want the students to know. We're not just waffling on, kind of hoping some of the information will land. We're saying, no, I really want you to know this. I expect you to know 12:15, trial by ordeal was replaced by trial by jury. I'm precise about that. And it helps them to get a foothold. What about something like telling story, narrative structures? I love this sort of thing. So you could say, look, imagine you're a molecule in the water, in the sea, and tell your neighbor the story of the molecule for the water cycle. This is try to include as many of these words as possible. Can you do this? So narratives, telling the story. This is another way of retrieval practice. It doesn't have to be a test. It can be, there are lots of ways. In the questioning, as Rosenshines says, and all of these things, he talks about process questions, as well as checking for understanding and questioning. Effective teachers will also ask more process questions, and this is how we should also be talking about retrieval. We should be modeling how we get success in a question like this. Why does your heart beat faster during exercise? It's actually a whole process to explain that. You need to know the knowledge, but then you need to know how to answer those questions. So Rosenshine has this thing about process questions which I find really useful. How do you know that? How did you think that through? So whenever we're giving answers to a problem, we should be talking about the knowledge base, but also how we knew it. And that level of metacognitive thinking is really, really key. So for example, if you're teaching about these questions here, these seem hard, but we need to provide supports for students to access them. And we teach them that whenever you get a circle, that seems difficult. So what you do is you label the diagram. That's the step. That's the step you need to take. So we teach the students the strategy, and then they learn to do that. So later on, when they come across a question like this, they learn that difficult strategy. And this is part of the whole thing of building a sequence of knowledge, the questioning, the reviewing, and making sure that they learn the strategy as well as learn the knowledge. Sometimes you just need to check they've understood the strategy, and we can remember that, not actually specific knowledge. So what's the strategy we always use when we have questions which aren't labelled? Yeah, we label the diagram. The first step is we need to remember to but before we even worry about the maths, let's call the sides of the shapes, and we remember the strategy. That's another retrieval act. The final thing is practice. Practice, practice, practice. You don't get good at anything that you don't practice. And that's one of the reasons I love Rosenshine, because he really places practice it gives it its proper place in teaching. Oddly, over the years, teachers have been kind of inhibited from, things like rote learning is bad, and repetition, weirdly, is bad. Drill is a bad word. You call all of those things practice. Immediately, they become normal. And he has this fantastic way of describing how you go from guided practice, where the teacher is close to the action, showing students what to do, picking up on early errors, and gradually withdrawing to allow the students to do it on their own. So I'll show you, I'll do it and help you, and now do it by yourself. And it makes total sense. That's how you should teach it. And significantly, with a high success rate. So in the practice phase, in the early practice phase, we need a high success rate. It mustn't feel too difficult. And Rosenshine suggests that there are studies where an 80% success rate in maths leads to a much better future success than, say, even like a 70% success. If the students are finding it too hard, they start feeling that they're not so good at it, maybe they apply less effort, and also they're practicing doing the wrong thing. If you practice at a low success rate, a lot of what you're practicing is practicing errors. So practicing successful strategies is much more useful. So just like in football coaching, where we break down the complexity of playing football into some specific skills that players can practice, like trap and pass, we can do that with lots of things. So here are things you can practice. Building automaticity. Changing your vocabulary. I've seen this with primary schools where teachers are struggling to get students to just stop saying everything is good, bad, and nice. They're the sort of the simplest adjectives that primary kids always use. Everything is either good, bad, or nice. And if we want them to say wicked, marvelous, fabulous, frightening, they're not going to just do that because you ask them to. They're going to do that because they practice it a lot. So you need to do lots of, let's describe the witch. The witch was wicked and frightening, and let's say that lots of times. And and if the students don't use words regularly, they're not going to become part of their vocabulary. So fluency comes through repetition. My son's favourite one at primary school, I always put this one in. There was a grey, monotonous sky. I used to love that. But he used it a lot. He probably overused it. And we'd say, oh, come on, Sam. He said, I know, I like it. It always works. There was a grey, monotonous sky. Impending doom. He worked out that was a good thing to do, but he practiced it a lot, became his phrase. But he used that thing in his French, he did his French exam last year. He got a top grade. And he was walking around the house before his oral exam saying, où que j'aille, quoi que je fasse. Où que j'aille, quoi que je fasse, da-da-da-da-da. Whatever it was. And it means, wherever I go, whatever I do. And it's the subjunctive. And I know, it's in both of the words, it's unusual form. But he just could say that fluently. Où que j'aille, quoi que je fasse, le soleil brille toujours, or something. Wherever I go, whatever I do. And through repetition and practice, he became confident. He aced the exam. Repetition and practice. Confidence. But things like, sentences, quick as a flash, or one of my favourite ones for English literature is at first glance. I've seen teachers turn students into these great, analysts, where at first glance makes you say, at first glance, the poem appears to be creating this image. However, what the poet really means is this. So if you practice saying at first glance, it makes you write in a certain style, at first glance. But you don't naturally write at first glance. You have to learn it, and then you have to practice it. And then when you're under pressure in an exam, it needs to be something you use all the time to be fluent with, and so on. So whatever it is, number bonds, column addition, even explaining things. I think you can practice explaining things. How does a transformer work? How does a loudspeaker work? How does an electric motor work? Well, it starts like this, and then you sort of feed back on that. Let's explain it better. Okay, I'll explain it better. And then the third or fourth time, yeah, that's good. I'm getting more fluent with explaining how a loudspeaker works. You can practice explaining things. Practice is important. And finally, then, we just need to make sure that we get the high success rate. There's a lot of stuff, I call this growth mindset cheese. There's a lot of horrible, laminated garbage around schools like this. We are, if we're trying to teach kids to add fractions, it's blatantly obvious that every mistake you make is progress. It's not progress, is it? And eventually you need to stop making the mistakes. And we lionize failure, weirdly, in schools. What we should be doing is teaching kids to unlock success. That's what we need. Growth mindset only has any real meaning if it leads to success. If we're saying, come on, you can do it better, and look, because you're succeeding. Like if you're coaching an athlete, you don't just keep telling them to work harder. You say, you analyze what they do, you give them specific feedback about a precise part of what they need to improve, and you get them to practice that hard, and when they start to see that it's working, then they start to think, hey, I might not be so bad at this. I can actually improve this. And that's where the success rate comes in. You need to see students feeling successful in order for them to believe that they can carry on and overcome their difficulties. And I think that's important. Teachers need to be unlocking success. That's part of the deal. And I think Rosenshine helps us to do that. So this theory of action that I talked about at the beginning, this idea of learning about schema forming and practice, it's all part of the mindset you just start developing. And you see all your schema forming brains in front of you, and you're consciously thinking about that as you teach. I really think that helps. So just to recap, Rosenshine has this sort of flow. You review material, you question better, you sequence the material better, you go from guided practice to independent practice. When you talk to teachers about this stuff, they just go, you know what, thank God. Someone is telling me what I've always thought. I get that feedback all the time. No bullshit, no fads, no gimmicks, no tricks. It's just common sense, they say. And it is. It's common sense. It's just about doing those things better. And if teachers think it's common sense, they're much more likely to embed that into their practice, change their habits, and become more effective teachers. So Rosenshine helps that, and I think it's great to have a resource like this, which enables research to get into the classroom and really make a difference for our students. So I hope that's useful. If you've never read it, you're definitely going to go away and read it now. So thank you very much. Any questions? I think I have 5 minutes for questions. No? Excellent. In your pairs, come up with a question, though. Seriously, any questions? Yes?
You speak about smaller steps. Isn't there a danger of making the surveys too palatable for students so they don't need to strain their brain?
That's a really good point. So, actually, one of the things that Rosenshine says, in fact, if I go back to this slide here, which you can't actually see, because it's so small. I gave you a picture of what it looked like, original version. I've lost it now. But basically, he actually says it's important to recognize that, here we go. I think it says at the bottom of here, it actually says, with older, more mature learners, the size of the step in presentation is larger, and student practice is more covert. So, absolutely. So he's very clear in the detail to say, these ideas vary with the age of the students and the level of sophistication of the students. So practice needs to be much more tiny steps and lots of guided practice. For the younger they are, the less confident they are. But sure, as the students get more sophisticated, you make the steps bigger. They don't need so much guided practice. They need to practice more on their own. And also it depends with different disciplines. He also says that subjects which are much more sort of strongly structured, like, say, science and geography and history and so on, these approaches are much more relevant to than, say, something like art and drama, where the knowledge isn't quite so neatly